And if Derrick Henry scores a touchdown, Hosanna, right? Wasn't it amazing to see 4 young men burst out of the waters of baptism, declaring their faith? Just very proud of them. We're launching a new series this week, and it's in the Old Testament book of Daniel. And actually, there's a lot of phrases out of the Old Testament book of Daniel that are still popular and used in modern language. For example, if you've ever heard the phrase, "the writing is on the wall," that actually comes originally from the book of Daniel. There's all kinds of those kinds of phrases, and there are some of the most spectacular stories that you can possibly imagine in the book of Daniel. But we're going to start with chapter 1 today. And I'm going to read a few verses of scripture, a little bit more than usual, because I want us to get the context of what it is we're talking about. So it says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim, his reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen from all the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, "I am afraid, my lord, the king, who ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I am afraid the king will have me beheaded." Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff and to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water," Daniel said. "At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the king's food. Instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of the visions and dreams. There's some spectacular moments, including fiery furnace and lion's dens and cryptic messages inscribed on a wall with a floating hand. But if we rush to those highlights without looking at this first chapter, we can actually miss one of the most important things that we can learn to understand those other things. What we will miss is God's very slow, very deliberate and intentional work that he begins right here in chapter 1. And there's a tension that's created in this chapter. I don't know if you noticed it, but there's 4 times in the passage that we read that there was the phrase, God gave. God gave. It was very important. God gave Nebuchadnezzar victory over King Jehoiakim. God gave special respect and affection to Daniel. God gave his friends special aptitude and wisdom. God gave Daniel the capacity to discern and understand visions and dreams. And the point, we could miss it very easily, but the point is that in all the chaos of what's going on in their lives, God is still in control. I think this is so important because a lot of times our idea of hope is that we find our hope when things begin to go in the direction that we want. Our grades improve at school. We get invited to some interviews for some job opportunities. Maybe the bank gets back to us and we're approved for a mortgage. Like, there's all these things. Now we can have hope because things are trending in the direction that we like. But Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel were all individuals who were between 14 and 17 years old, just like the young men who were baptized in our baptismal this morning. And they were taken away from their families, away from their hometown, away from their homeland, traveled hundreds of miles to a culture that was completely and radically different from anything they had ever known. And the whole idea was to enculturate them into that space, not for them to bring anything from the past to them. If you were to ask them, who's in control of my life, I wonder if they would have said God right away, because everything had gone wrong. And so what I want us to know is that we find hope when we remember God is in control. We find hope when we remember God is in control. I'm not saying you're in control, and I'm not saying things are going the way you want right now, but hope is found when we come to the realization, when we begin to remember God actually is in control. To make matters worse, the king that had been the king of Israel before this Babylon besieged them was Jehoiakim, and his father was actually a pretty good king, but Jehoiakim, he basically tried to undo everything his father had done, and he promoted pagan practices. He used forced labor. He would conscript people. He had some very large and luxurious palaces he wanted to build for himself, and he would take people, force them to work, wouldn't pay them a living wage. And then on top of all of those things, he was also a person who had no respect for any kind of spiritual authority. Jeremiah sent him a scroll of some words from God. He took that scroll, cut it up into pieces, and then burned it in the fire. He didn't just read it and say, I don't know if I agree with this. He cut it up and he burned it in the fire. He's making a statement. And this is kind of the spiritual climate that existed when Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel were still living in Israel. And he had aligned with foreign powers. In order to protect himself, he didn't trust God and he didn't trust his own military, so he aligned himself with surrounding nations. And the way that you can do that is that you pay a tribute, you pay a fee to the nation, and they will help protect you. And then he had to add taxes to all the people in Israel so that he could keep his work going on his luxurious palaces and maintain his position. Please hear this. We all understand that those are out-of-bounds behavior. I don't know anybody that would stand up and say, I support what King Jehoiakim was doing. And here's the point, is that what he was doing was sinning, and sin doesn't just hurt guilty people. Sin hurts innocent people. It's one of the things that makes it sin. His actions are not just offensive to people, they're destroying people. It's not just something I don't like when I hear or I see, but there are people who are being beaten, their lives are less as a result of actions that he has taken. And so Nebuchadnezzar besieges Israel, and the Bible tells us God gave Nebuchadnezzar the victory. If you ask Nebuchadnezzar who's in control, he will tell you he is. If you ask Jehoiakim who's in control, he thought he was until his country was overrun and occupied. But all the while, it's God that's in control. Daniel wants us to pull back the curtain and see heaven's actual engagement in our world, even when it feels like it's nothing but chaos. And that's not just for an ancient people a long time ago. When our world feels like chaos, we will not find hope in waiting for the people who we prefer to be in control and do the things that we would like. We find hope when we recognize God is in control of it all. How many are grateful God has not given up control of our lives or our world? He hasn't. He hasn't. God also gave the chief of staff respect and affection for Daniel. Now you could say that, well, Daniel was probably a well-behaved young man. He obviously was smart. He had a lot of things going for him. He got the attention of, and all those things are true, but this chief of staff is processing a lot of people. Why would Daniel and his friends stand out? And the answer is that God gave him the respect and affection partly because of how they're living, but partly because it's something we need to understand. That favor in our world is not just someone's opinion of us. Sometimes it's the way God opens the door for us. And God gives them favor. And then God gave them unusual aptitude for understanding. God didn't seem to do this for me when I was in school. My report cards were abysmal until I got to college. It was just something else. But God gave them the ability. How many wish God could do that for you? Two. He also gave Daniel the ability to interpret dreams and visions. And just like the young men who went into the waters of baptism today, they're probably between 14 and 17 years old. There's a Hebrew word used for adolescent young men. That's the word that's used of these guys. And they're going to go into a 3-year educational program. That brings us to our second point, is that we find hope when we remember who we are. We find hope when we remember that God is actually in control, regardless of how it looks. We also find hope when we remember who we are. One of Babylon's first moves was to change the identity of the young men that they had captured and now brought to the chief city of their country. And one of the ways that they would do that, in addition to learning languages and literature, was also to change your name. They changed all their names. Daniel's name was God is my judge. That's what it means in Hebrew. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means God is gracious. Mishael means God who is like God. And Azariah means God helps. I want you to think of their names together. It's fascinating. God is my judge. He is gracious. Who is like him? He will help. Aren't those great names? Yeah. Babylon doesn't want them to be known by those names, so they give them names all related to the gods that they serve: Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. And what they want you to know is not only am I going to call you something different, but I want to rewrite your story. And here's the thing about our world. In every culture, there's always a Babylon. In every culture, there's always someone who wants to rename us. In every culture, there's always some force that wants to change our story. And if things are going really bad in our lives, that can be very tempting. Our idea sometimes of a fresh start is a new name, and I'll just be somebody I've never been before. And yet, that's not the source of hope. So for Daniel and his friends, they could not avoid the names that they were going to be called. For Daniel and his friends, they could not ignore the education that they were required to learn. They didn't have an option of dropping the class. They were required to be in attendance. But Babylon wasn't just wanting them to fit in. Babylon wanted them to have an allegiance to them. And our world still works like this. So Daniel found this really interesting way. I'm not sure I would have thought it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have thought it. But he decided that he did have one option to exercise that would help him not assimilate completely into the culture of Babylon around him, and it had to do with his diet. He can't control what people are going to call him, and he can't control what the professor is going to teach, but he decides that he can control what he eats. And the food that was coming was actually coming from the king's kitchens. And this shouldn't be overlooked. This is what the king is doing subtly. He's saying, look, if you do well and you get a job in the palace, you're going to get to eat like this every single day. It's a temptation to indulgence and to compromise and to allegiance. Just eat this. This could be your life. Wouldn't that be great? And Daniel chooses faithfulness to God instead. And it seems like such a small thing, but it was a way for Daniel to remember who he was. I'm not a Babylonian. I'm part of the tribe of people that God raised up in the world to be a blessing to the world. Now, Israel, if you know anything about Israel's dietary code, they had some pretty strict rules. Like, does anybody here like bacon, pulled pork? Yeah? Some of you are going to have that today. Not in Israel. Not even on a football game day. Wouldn't do it. And how many like fish? Only fish with scales and fins. All other seafood was out of bounds. Yeah? Insects? How many just love some insects? There's only 2 kinds of insects that Israel was allowed to eat. One of them was grasshoppers. And it's been a long time since I've had a grasshopper. The reason why this is important to understand is Daniel is not rejecting prison rations. He's not saying, I refuse to eat this horrible sludge you call food and go on some kind of a hunger strike. No. He is rejecting royal food. And how he goes about it is fascinating to me. He didn't get this from the American culture. I know that for a fact. He goes and he asks permission. Would it be okay if we didn't eat that food? And the chief of staff has a pretty strong reaction to that. This is also what's interesting to me. Daniel, who is basically a prisoner against his will, he's been kidnapped from his homeland, demonstrates more courage in this morning than the chief of staff to the king. Daniel's asking for an option, and the chief of staff says, if something goes wrong, the king might cut off my head. I don't want that to happen. So Daniel goes to the attendant that's assigned to him by the chief of staff and says, just test me and my friends for 10 days. That's it. That's all I'm asking. Just give us vegetables and water, and if we don't look as good as everybody else, then you can do what you want. Quite honestly, I'm not sure what to make of that passage. And I don't hear anybody in religious circles today talking about things like this, where he doesn't act like he's in control. He asks for permission, and he allows someone else to make an assessment, and then you can do what's necessary. That is astonishing to me. And yet God uses it. 10 days later, he and his friends looked better than all the other students. And what's fascinating is that while these are formative days in the lives of these young men, they are also developing influence in the world around them. How many would love to see our young men and our young women in our culture, while they're being formed by God's grace, also have an influence in our world? Does that sound like a really good idea? I think it does. If all we do is try to copy the culture. Now, this is not a call to eat weird or dress weird. All right? None of you would remember this. It's been so long ago, but I used to wear a suit and a tie every single Sunday. It's how I was raised. And not just because I was a preacher. In the house I was raised in, I mean, they got pictures of me, little tiny, got to carry me around in a suit and a tie. That's how it was back then. And then the staff colluded with my wife. And they went through my closet. And they replaced my suits and ties with this. I'm still a little sensitive about that. It's not just about copying the culture. We cannot be an influence if all we do is try to replicate everything we see around us. If you want to be an influence in this world, if you want to find hope in any circumstance, it starts with I trust God is still in control, even though I'm not sure what he's up to, and I believe I belong to him. And if you can nail down those two things, unbelievable. Unbelievable. In ways I can't describe and cannot explain, hope begins to form inside of you. Even in the face of the most outrageous odds and the most disappointing news, you still have this hope. Daniel and his friends could not avoid some of the things of Babylon, but they refused to allow Babylon to define who they were. And by the way, Daniel's not trying to prove himself to the chief of staff, to the king Nebuchadnezzar, or even to God. Every time we're trying to prove ourselves to anybody, we always get in trouble. That's what some people define their faith as. I'm going to prove. No. Proving is just another form of self-righteousness. And that will always take you places you don't want to go. He was going to be faithful to God. This is what he knew about God. This is from Genesis, the 12th chapter. This is what God said to his progenitor, his ancestor. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous. And so, famous. Keep listening. And you will be a blessing to others. Why am I going to make you famous? So you can be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families of the earth, will be blessed through you. It's a picture of grace. Self-righteousness is always trying to prove I belong, I'm good enough. Grace is accepting who God is and what he has done, and then living accordingly. It's a very different way to live. When we accept who God is, that's when we discover who we are. When we accept what God has done, that's when we begin to discover what we are to do. God has not called us to self-righteousness. He's called us to grace. Now, I can't imagine if Daniel had access to social media, but if he did, I'm pretty sure that he wouldn't have been posting pictures of his current diet, trying to make them look as appetizing as possible. Have you ever seen anybody do that with vegetables, try to make them look good? Did you notice you don't have to do that with a chocolate sundae? It just looks good. You don't have to add any filters, anything. He's not posting the menu, and he's not taking shots at a kingdom that he doesn't agree with. He just simply chooses to live faithfully in a way that he can, in a place that he is. And what he believes is, God can see me right where I am. And if you believe God sees you, it changes everything. And if you believe God doesn't see you, nothing ever changes. Nothing. The loss of hope in our world is not based on circumstances and situations. We'd like to think that. Oh, they lost hope because. No. The loss of hope in our world is because we're losing our spiritual grip and our spiritual sight. This world is going to have challenging moments and difficult times. It's going to have disappointing news. And we are not going to be exempt from it because we sit ourselves in rows in rooms like this. But we can face that very differently than the rest of the world does. We can face it with hope. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up. Just one more thing. We find hope when we remember why we're here. We find hope when we remember God is in control. We find hope when we remember who we are, and we find hope when we remember why we're here. God gave Daniel and his friends these amazing gifts, opportunities, favor, capacities, abilities, aptitudes, all of it. But it wasn't for their benefit. It wasn't so that they could have a cushy job and live a life of luxury and comfort while others suffered. His gifts were for others. When your heart is set on serving God, you realize something really profound. You can do it anywhere. It doesn't require a spotlight, it doesn't require a limelight, it doesn't require anyone noticing. That if your heart is set on serving, you will always have an opportunity to serve, even in a strange land. And no land could have been stranger for Daniel and his friends than Babylon. So who are you becoming? Who are you listening to? What is it you're going to believe? Because this little screen tells me a lot of things. It tells me what my future is going to be. It tells me who my identity is. And if I believe it, I find myself increasing in anxiety and losing hope. But even in the face of very difficult things, if I trust that God is in action in all of it, he's not missing in action, he's actually acting. He's working things out right now. If I remember that I'm not just someone who thinks spiritual thoughts on occasion, but I actually belong to a God who created me and gave his son for me. And if I realize that the reason that I am here is not just so that my life is better, but so that the grace and the goodness of God can be shared with others. I don't know how to describe it, but hope breaks through the darkness. It's like a tear opens in the heavens and in my heart, and hope begins to spring forth. And it's all because God is who he says he is. He does what he says he will do, and he's not done with you. Would you bow your heads, please? Father, thank you. Thank you that you have not changed. Thank you that you are still at work, even though sometimes it's not obvious to us. Thank you that we belong to you, even if others will not accept us. And thank you that you have a purpose for our lives beyond our comfort. You have a purpose for our lives that makes a real difference in our world. We thank you for that in Jesus' name.